This happened when I was 13 years old. Back then, I had a close friend named Aiden. He was a couple of years older than me, but we still got along mainly because our houses were right next to each other. The rest of our neighborhood was mostly filled with older people, so we didn't really have anyone else to play with. Most nights, we played random games outside until we got too tired or our parents called us in. This was before the internet was a big deal, so we did this a lot. One of the games we played the most was hide and seek, but with a variation where the seeker had to use a flashlight at all times. The big rule of the game was that the person seeking had to keep the flashlight on no matter what, and the person hiding was considered found if they got revealed by the flashlight. It made the game interesting because the hider was better able to know where the seeker was and use it to their advantage when repositioning, but the seeker could just as easily shine their huge circle of light in the hider's direction from a distance, ending the game. We typically set the boundaries to anywhere in the close parts of the neighborhood, though our neighborhood was right on the edge of a huge stretch of woods, so sometimes we made things interesting by making that the playing area. We never set a limit as to how far the hunter could go because typically we just genuinely didn't want to go that far. Considering we played the game at night, it admittedly made for a fairly creepy setting. This one time, it was my turn to be the hider, and Aiden and I had both agreed to make the woods the playing area for this round. I remember wanting to make it a challenge, so I headed out further than I usually did. Quickly, I started to regret this. It got very dark away from any house lights, and by this point, I couldn't see any lights whatsoever since Aiden had the only flashlight. This made traversing the woods especially difficult. All I had for light was what little was provided by the moon. After I kept walking for a while, I eventually came across an abandoned cabin. I knew this would be the perfect spot. There was no way I was going to be found in there. I stepped inside and fumbled my way around to a set of stairs. I walked up them and came across a bedroom with a single window that somehow pointed back to my neighborhood, which by this point was way too far away to see anymore. I sat there for a long time, but nothing happened. Then, out of a window, I saw Aiden. However, he wasn't using the flashlight, he was cheating. Clearly, he had gotten tired of the flashlight constantly revealing his position and was either covering it with his hand or had turned it off completely. I watched as his black silhouette walked closer and closer to the cabin. I began to hear leaves crunching under his footsteps as he continued forward. Eventually, he got close enough to where I could no longer see him out of the window, though I could still hear his footsteps from downstairs. Just then, out of the window, I saw the heart-dropping sight of Aiden with the flashlight walking around way off in the distance, but I could still hear footsteps from downstairs. Slowly, it hit me, whoever was downstairs wasn't Aiden. Instinctively, I got down and hid underneath a nearby bed. To my horror, the footsteps began slowly walking up the stairs. When they got to the top, I could hear the click of a gun. My heart was pounding out of my chest by this point. A few seconds passed when I saw large boots walk into the room that in no way could have been Aiden's. They stood still near the door for what felt like an eternity before turning around and leaving the room. I took this opportunity to get out from under the bed and jump out of the window. When I landed and got to my feet, I just started running. I could hear footsteps gaining on me from behind, but I didn't look back. Eventually, Aiden saw me running at him and instantly pointed his flashlight on me, saying that he could see me, and then he won the round. But when I didn't stop running, his eyes moved to behind me, and the expression on his face instantly faded. He turned and began running with me towards my house. Not long after, we reached it and went inside, locking the door behind us. Aiden and I were both now just as shaken up as I was. Aiden began questioning what had just happened. Disturbingly, he then asked me who the man was that was running behind me. I still remembered getting goosebumps hearing him say this. I proceeded to tell him the whole story from start to finish, and he didn't question a single bit of it. We then told my parents but did our best to downplay the situation as much as possible, making it seem like it wasn't a big deal so that they wouldn't completely freak out. They ended up calling the cops, who came out to search the cabin and the surrounding area. They searched for multiple hours, but no one was found. From then on, both of our parents didn't allow either of us to go into those woods, and I can't say this was at all disappointing. You couldn't have paid me to go back into those woods. This whole experience was extremely traumatizing, much more for me than Aiden, at least I assume. We've never been back to that cabin, and we both still can't explain who we had seen that night. A few months ago, my wife and I celebrated our second anniversary by taking a break from work to enjoy a special getaway in the snowy mountains of Wyoming. We decided to rent a cabin in a remote area, which we thought would be a romantic and tranquil experience. The cabin, owned by a friend of a friend who offered us a discount, exceeded our expectations. Nestled in the heart of the wilderness, it felt like something out of a postcard. However, we soon realized that the isolation came with some unexpected details. There was no phone service, which initially bothered us, but later added to the charm of the place. We spent our first night by the cozy fireplace, watching a movie I had downloaded on my laptop. As the evening grew late, we decided to unwind in the hot tub on the back porch. The hot tub, fully operational and inviting, was an irresistible feature. It was during this relaxing soak that I realized I had left my swim trunks in the car parked out front. As I ventured outside, I noticed fresh boot prints in the snow that clearly didn't belong to me or my wife. They led from the middle of the forest to one of the living room windows and back into the woods. This unusual discovery raised a couple of red flags. There had been no knocking, and the footprints were directed toward the window instead of the door. I shared my discovery with my wife, and she was understandably more unsettled than I was. Given the remote location, it was indeed a strange occurrence that warranted concern. We decided to drive to a nearby town with cell service and contacted the cabin owner, inquiring whether someone was expected at the cabin that night. Despite sending the message, we received no response within 30 minutes, which we could understand given the late hour. We decided to return to the cabin, hoping that the issue was a mere overreaction on our part. We planned to check for a response in the morning when we would visit town. Back at the cabin, neither of us felt like enjoying the hot tub anymore, so we went to bed, both tired from the day's events. However, around 3 a.m., I was abruptly awakened, which was unusual as I am typically a deep sleeper. I heard a slight bump on the bedroom window, but the curtains prevented me from seeing the source. At first, I thought it might be a chunk of falling snow, so I tried to dismiss it and go back to sleep. Only a few seconds later, the noise came again, louder this time. My concerns grew, and I decided to investigate. I opened the curtains and turned on the flashlight on my phone, casting light onto the window. To my shock, I saw fresh boot prints in the snow beneath the window. Panic started to set in as I raised the flashlight towards the trees, following the tracks to a figure standing in the snow about 10 yards away. I quickly closed the window, trying to remain calm. I woke up my wife, insisting that we had to leave immediately. She complied without further questions, and in a matter of minutes, we had our belongings at the front door, ready to go. I opened the door, and we dashed toward the car. However, just as we were leaving, my wife screamed. I turned to see the figure right beside the house, watching us as we fled. I pressed the gas pedal harder and sped down the private road. Only when we regained cell service did we send a message to the cabin owner, explaining the situation. Later that morning, we received a text from the owner, who had investigated the cabin. He confirmed the presence of boot prints all around the building, and the prints had indeed stopped at each window. We were left baffled and terrified by this information, but the situation seemed to be beyond our control. We decided to cut our trip short and spent the rest of our time off at home. To this day, we still don't know the identity of the figure or their intentions that night. As far as we know, nothing further transpired, and we're not entirely sure we even want to uncover the answers to these questions. Sometimes, some mysteries remain unsolved, but our safety and peace of mind remain our top priorities. When I was around 16 years old, growing up in a small town in Elko County, Nevada, my friends and I had a common interest in exploring the hills in our area. This particular incident occurred at the northern end of Ruby Valley, just north of the road off Highway 93 that leads into the valley. I had a fascination with old mine shafts, ghost towns, and all things related to the past, so I decided to venture out. I gassed up my trusty 1972 Dodge W200 pickup and, being a bit of a redneck and a gun enthusiast, I grabbed my 91 Hong Kong dollars rifle. This was partly because I'd previously encountered mountain lions and other dangers in the wilderness, and also, to be honest, because I enjoyed shooting. Armed and fueled up, I set off. I started my journey by discovering some old foundations in the lower areas and then ventured deeper into the mountains. I followed an ancient road that was barely more than an overgrown cattle path by that point. As I continued, I began stumbling upon abandoned mine shafts, which I found pretty cool. I kept going, steadily making my way up the hills. Then, as I crossed a fallen tree, something changed. An unsettling feeling washed over me, as if I were being watched. It was a warm June day, and typically, you'd hear the loud chorus of cicadas in the background wherever you went. But here, it was eerily silent. The moment I crossed that fallen tree, the mountains fell into a deafening silence, no bugs, no birds, just complete and unnerving quiet. As I approached a bend in the road, I realized not only did I feel watched, but the absence of any sound outside was deeply unsettling. I knew something wasn't right, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The road led to an old cabin that appeared untouched for quite some time. It was eerie how well preserved it was, with intact glass windows and remnants of curtains. Inside, the place was astonishingly well furnished for a remote cabin, with plates, cookware, tattered clothing, and personal items left behind. The dinner table was set for 4 people, which was unusual for such an abandoned place. It felt like whoever lived here had left everything behind in a hurry. Despite my growing sense of unease, I explored further, eventually heading outside in search of a nearby mine shaft. To comfort myself, I chambered around in my 91 Hong Kong dollars, causing the echoing sound to break the silence. Behind me, I spotted an old well, still intact. As I approached it, I heard a faint rustling, and a putrid, overpowering smell filled the air, the unmistakable stench of decay and copper. I didn't dare get any closer to the well, my instinct screaming at me to leave. Turning to my left, I spotted the entrance to a mine shaft on a nearby hill. As I approached, I felt a strange, hot breeze coming from it. This was unusual. Typically, mine shafts maintain a cool, constant temperature. The closer I got, the more a sense of dread and the feeling of being watched enveloped me. When I got about 15 feet from the opening, I was hit by an even stronger wave of that awful smell. Then, a dark shadow moved inside the mine shaft, slowly making its way toward the opening. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion, but the dimensions of the mine shaft didn't match. My heart raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. As it approached, I noticed the creature was covered in grayish-brown fur, and when it screamed, the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deafening, and my ears rang from it. Panicked, I did what any sensible person with a rifle would do. I shot at it, firing 5 rounds as fast as I could. I heard 4 solid thuds and 1 shot that went high, and the creature screamed in pain. Then, I started hearing more screams, both from the well and the hills above the mine shaft. The situation was spiraling out of control. I turned and sprinted down the hill toward the tree line, where I could see movement and hear more screams. The creatures, whatever they were fast, and they kept to the trees. They were heading closer, and I fired rounds in their direction, all the while making a beeline for my truck, roughly 200 yards away. My truck roared to life, and I wasted no time getting out of there. I nearly drove my truck off the canyon's edge in my haste to leave the area. Finally back on pavement, I stopped to collect myself. When I returned to town, I was still in shock. My dad, who had been a guide in the Ruby Mountains for years, could tell something had shaken me. He asked where I'd been, and when I described my route and the cabin, he advised me never to return, especially alone. Since then, I've never gone back, but something still draws me to that place. Despite the terrifying encounter, I feel the need for closure, and one day, I hope to return with friends, cameras, and some well-armed backup. There's something about the area that keeps calling me back, despite the horrors I experienced. In the years that followed, I tried to research the incident, speaking with some old-timers. One of them told me a chilling story about the Ruby Mountains during the 1940s and 1950s, involving crashes of military aircraft in the region. Ranchers were recruited to help recover the bodies of the deceased crew members. The details were disturbing, as they encountered a gruesome scene of severely injured and dismembered soldiers at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet. However, I couldn't see a direct connection between this story and my own unsettling experience. In August of 2001, a unique family trip unfolded as I, a 14-year-old about to enter high school, accompanied my father and older sister, whom I'll call Ruth, on a fishing adventure in Canada. My father, who worked in the New York textile trade, had a business connection in Montreal, and their plan was to strengthen their bond over fishing in the wilderness of northern Quebec. The Canadian contact brought along his teenage son, making it a family affair. Ruth and I, often dubbed partners in crime by our parents due to our shared knack for getting into trouble, were considered harmless and were thus allowed to join the adventure. The journey was a 2-day drive from New York City, with the first leg taking us to Montreal. The next morning, we met up with Dad's business associate, and together, we embarked on a northward drive. We left the bustling city behind, transitioning into a part of Quebec where English was a rarity. Ruth had 2 years of high school French, while I had some knowledge from junior high, and my father was fluent. We did our best to communicate, and the locals were understanding of our attempts. After a few hours of driving beyond the main highways, we found ourselves on a quiet road, sharing the path only with SUVs and trucks belonging to local loggers. We were captivated by the enormous trucks transporting massive tree trunks, a sight entirely foreign to us suburban girls. We playfully mused about encountering some charming lumberjacks, a joke that continued until we reached our fishing destination. Dad secured fishing licenses, and we loaded supplies, including food, onto a company boat before setting off down the river. The scene was idyllic, with dense forests, distant mountains, a crystal-clear lake, and the only sound being the boat's motor. We passed several cabins along the shore, each featuring a small dock and a few rowboats tethered to them. A few cabins had smoke rising from their chimneys. We continued south across the lake to our cabin. Little did we know that it was on an island in the middle of the lake, accessible solely by boat. The island was flat and just large enough for the cabin, a woodpile, and a small dock with a couple of rowboats. The nearest land was a few hundred feet away. Our hopes of meeting cute lumberjacks were quickly dashed, as we were nowhere near any potential suitors. The boat docked at the small wooden pier on the island, and we began unloading our supplies. The cabin was surprisingly comfortable, equipped with bunk beds and a wood stove. We settled in and prepared dinner, a hearty tin stew. It was clear that the focus of this trip was to strengthen the bond between the fathers, while Ruth and I were left to amuse ourselves. For some reason, after dinner, I was drawn outside. The tranquility was overwhelming. Oddly, there were no sounds, no birds chirping, nothing but eerie silence. I gazed at the dense undergrowth on the distant shore, and it felt as though no white person had ever set foot there. But then, I noticed a tall, humanoid figure lurking in the shadows, watching me. The creature had a deer-like head but stood on two legs, and its gaze emanated hostility. Although it was some distance away, I was unnerved by its presence. Back in the cabin, I locked the door and grabbed a paperback book to distract myself from what I had seen. I lost myself in the book until Dad returned and questioned why the door was locked. I concocted an excuse, claiming that the wind kept blowing it open, not wanting to admit the truth. The next morning, we headed out on the lake for some early morning fishing. I tried to engage myself in the activity but found it difficult. I considered swimming to the shore, but my family dissuaded me due to the cold water. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I ever returned to those primal woods, carrying with me the memory of that eerie encounter. Less than a month later, I started high school, and the world changed forever with the events of 9/11. Although I've been on many adventures since, I've never encountered such primal wilderness again. The story leaves me wondering what might happen if I were to revisit that remote, enigmatic island in Canada. A couple of years back, my family used to rent cabins at a large lake with my grandparents every summer. It was our annual retreat, a place where we could barbecue, swim, and enjoy pontoon rides for fishing and other fun activities. However, my first impression of the cabin we rented wasn't the best. It had an eerie feel to it, and the neighbors gave us strange looks when we arrived. Fast forward to the second night of our stay. My brother and I were having trouble sleeping, so we decided to sneak out and sit by a nearby pond. We both had our phones with us, and it wasn't long before my brother fell asleep. Seizing the opportunity, I took some of his stash and smoked, enjoying the serene night by the water's edge, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. Suddenly, a strange noise caught my attention from across the pond. I strained to see what was causing it, but the high made it difficult to focus. After a few minutes, a figure emerged from the darkness on the other side of the pond, and my heart sank. It was a tall man with a hood over his head, dressed entirely in black. He stood at an imposing 6'7", and in his hand, he held a shovel. I froze in place as he made eye contact with me, then to my horror, he started sprinting in my direction. Panic set in, and I bolted back to the cabin, with him hot on my heels as I rounded the pond. He was incredibly fast, but I was closer to the cabins. I reached my driveway and hid behind a car, watching him search for me about 20 yards away. When he turned away to check behind a nearby building, I seized the opportunity and sneaked back into the cabin. I locked all the doors and went to bed, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. The rest of the trip passed by, but I couldn't shake the eerie encounter. I couldn't help but wonder what that man was doing with a shovel in the middle of the night, chasing after me. I'll never know for sure, but I'll always remember that creepy giant figure in the woods and the unsettling events of that night. Back when I was 9 years old, I found myself spending some time at a quaint cottage in Ontario. The cottage was part of a small community of 12 similar cottages, arranged in a semicircle around a central park. During my stay, I befriended an older kid named Brandon, who was around 14 years old. Brandon was an unusual character, the kind of child who appeared to be a constant source of disappointment for his parents, though I never had the chance to meet them. He had a rebellious streak, often ignoring their calls, even late at night. As a young and rather well-behaved child, I couldn't fathom someone not wanting to be close to their parents. But, being my older brother's friend, I tagged along, as I idolized my brother. To be honest, I didn't particularly like Brandon, but my brother did, so I was stuck with him. Eventually, Brandon got the idea to sneak out one night, and of course, my brother followed suit. Since we shared a room, I had no choice but to accompany them. Initially, we wandered to the nearby park, where we hung out for a while. As time passed, it became apparent that we were all getting bored. I suggested we return to bed, but the older kids were calling the shots. Brandon proposed we explore the woods, and although I protested, my objections were swiftly overruled. We ventured into the woods, relying on the dim light from Brandon's phone to guide us. These woods weren't particularly dense, and we could even hear the distant hum of a nearby highway a few miles away. After a few minutes of wandering, I expressed my desire to turn back, but I was faced with two choices: walk back in the dark or stick with them. After a few more minutes, I noticed an eerie silence in the woods. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves, an unsettling stillness. I pointed this out to the others, and we all stopped to listen. After a brief moment of complete silence, the tranquility was shattered by my brother, who, in an irritated tone, asked me to be quiet. "I'm trying to listen," he scolded. Just as I was about to protest, I heard it too: heavy, labored breathing, like someone gasping for breath. I whispered that it wasn't me, I could hear it too. My brother's eyes widened, and the breathing grew louder, sounding almost excited. Simultaneously, we all looked up and saw a pair of glowing blue lights swaying above us. We were all mesmerized for a moment, until a gut-wrenching moan shattered the trance. It was the most horrifying sound I'd ever heard, as if a lifetime smoker were trying to scream while out of breath. The sound jolted us into action, and we started running. Behind us, we heard branches snapping and trees shaking. Whatever it was, it seemed to be in the trees. I wasn't much of a runner, partly due to my oversized feet, and I knew I wouldn't keep up for long. My legs began to ache, and I had to slow down. My brother and Brandon continued ahead, leaving me behind. As the unknown pursuer closed in, I made a quick decision. I dove into a nearby bush to hide. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on my side, as the bush was thorny, and I found myself covered in painful cuts and scratches. I bit my lip to stifle a cry of pain and lay there, listening. Something heavy crashed to the forest floor, and I watched from the bush as the two lights from earlier illuminated the small clearing where I hid. However, they weren't lights, they were eyes. The eyes revealed a nightmarish creature that stood about 7 feet tall. It was emaciated, with dark gray skin that clung unnaturally tightly to its body. Its long arms ended in clawed hands, but the most disturbing feature was its chest. The ribcage was grotesquely open, lacking a sternum. Instead, a black, pulsating mass filled the cavity. I couldn't see its face clearly, its eyes were too bright. Still, I knew it had a mouth because it was breathing heavily. The creature stood in the clearing for a while, seemingly searching for me. After what felt like an eternity, it departed. I stayed hidden in the thorny bush for hours, not emerging until I saw the sun rising above the horizon. Then, ignoring my bleeding wounds and tattered clothes, I ran as best I could in the direction I thought the cottage was. It felt like hours of running until I reached a break in the trees. I stumbled onto a busy highway and passed out. I woke up in a hospital, where someone had seen me fall out of the woods, covered in blood and wearing torn pajamas. My parents arrived to take me home, but no one believed my story. I insisted, but they assumed I had just spent too much time in the woods. My brother returned home safely before I did, having informed the authorities, and a search party was sent out. It's been over 7 years since that terrifying night, and I've scoured the internet in search of similar encounters, but found nothing. If anyone can help me identify that creature, I'd greatly appreciate it. When I was about 6 years old, my family and I traveled to Tennessee for my parents' honeymoon. We had rented a cabin in a picturesque location near a serene lake. One day, my father and I decided to spend some time by the lake. While my dad was preparing the boat at the dock, I spotted a deer, and being the curious and animal-loving child that I was, I couldn't resist following it into the nearby woods. As I ventured deeper into the forest, a sense of being watched came over me, a feeling that had often proven correct in the past. I turned around and found the deer standing just 10 feet away, its eyes fixed on me. What struck me as incredibly odd were the deer's eyes, which resembled human eyes but with an unsettling shade of red. Even more peculiar was the sight of its neck, appearing to be stitched to its head. I cautiously circled around the deer, all the while maintaining eye contact. The situation frightened me, and I attempted to calm myself by speaking to it. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you," I stammered, my voice trembling with fear. The deer's expression changed slightly, and to my astonishment, it appeared to smile, revealing teeth that were uncannily square, much like a human's. What happened next is something I still struggle to believe. The deer spoke to me. Its words sent shivers down my spine, and I felt an urgent need to get away. I heard my dad's voice calling my name, and when I turned around, he was rushing toward me. The moment the deer heard my dad's voice, it bolted into the darkness of the forest. When I looked back, it had vanished. My dad was understandably concerned and scolded me for wandering off. I explained that I had followed the deer, and I couldn't help but mention its peculiar human-like eyes and smile. His face grew serious, and he hurriedly took my hand, instructing me to forget about it and come back to the boat. For a while, I managed to put the encounter out of my mind, and we continued to enjoy our time on the lake. However, when we returned to shore, the strange deer appeared once more, now standing on its hind legs. Its jaw was grotesquely disfigured, dripping with blood. I let out a piercing scream, and the creature hastily retreated into the woods, running on 2 legs with a limp. My dad was alarmed and asked what had frightened me. I pointed towards the forest, where a man in deer hide disappeared deeper into the woods. That night, I refused to venture outside, shaken by the disturbing sights I had witnessed. As I grew older, I couldn't help but recall that fateful night. I decided to research the area where we had stayed, and it turned out that we had been on old Native American land. What I had encountered might have been a skinwalker, a creature from indigenous folklore capable of shape-shifting and malevolent intentions. This experience has left me with lasting anxiety, particularly when I encounter deer while walking home from school or during hunting trips my dad invites me on. I wish I had never followed that strange man-deer thing into the forest.